Rome was the most powerful empire in the world. They had legions of soldiers that were feared throughout Europe, and they even built roads throughout their entire empire, so that they could send aid or reinforcements anywhere quickly. The Roman Empire had been around for over 200 years at this point. They had crushed rebellions. They had defeated armies from all across the world. But one man would bring them to their knees. He was just a slave, but he would turn the tables and make Rome pay for their cruelty. But who was this man, and how did he do it? Well, let's find out. In 73 BC, there was a group of slaves that lived on the Lycaea state in the Roman province of Hispania. At this point, the Roman Empire was growing fast, and the demand for slaves was higher than ever. Slaves were used for many different things. Some were teachers, some worked in the fields, and others were forced to fight to death in the Colosseum. It was a hard life, and most of these slaves dreamed of one day being free. One of these slaves was a young man named Spartacus. His mother was an Iberian woman, while his father was said to be a Roman soldier. This made Spartacus half-white, and he looked very different from most of the other slaves on the plantation. As a kid, Spartacus spent most of his time with the Thracian slaves. Even though they were from different places, they became close friends. Spartacus was known as a strong, brave, and intelligent young man. Everyone thought he had a great future ahead of him. When Spartacus turned 20, he was sold to a slave trader. He was then taken to Rome, where he would be put up for auction. Spartacus didn't want to be sold, so he tried to run away. But he was caught and beaten by Roman soldiers. He was then sold to Lentulus, who was a cruel Roman aristocrat. Now that he was in Rome, Spartacus saw how evil the Romans really were. He saw people being killed just for fun. He saw beggars ignored and stepped on. He even saw senators plotting to destroy each other's families. Spartacus was angry because the Romans seemed to not care about anyone except themselves. One night, Spartacus and some of the other slaves were having dinner together. They talked about what a horrible place Rome was, and how they couldn't take it anymore. They decided that they wanted to escape, so they created a plan. They knew that if they tried to leave the city, the guards would stop them. So they came up with the idea of killing the guards and taking their armor. Then they would pretend to be Roman soldiers and walk right out the front gate. That night, Spartacus and the other slaves snuck into the guards' barracks. They quietly took out the guards one by one until every single one was dead. They then took their armor and weapons and met up with some rebel slaves. Together, they stormed the gate and walked out as real Roman soldiers. Spartacus and the other slaves ran into the forest as fast as they could. They were afraid that the Romans would come after them. Luckily, the Romans didn't chase them. Instead, they sent a message to all the other provinces, telling them to capture the escaped slaves. Spartacus and the rebels kept running until they reached Thrace. Here, they found a small group of people who had also escaped from the Romans. These people welcomed Spartacus and the others, and even gave them food and water. Now that they weren't hungry, Spartacus and the others started to look for a place to hide. That's when they found an old abandoned fortress. It was perfect because the Romans would never think to look for them here. Spartacus and the other slaves fixed up the fortress and made it into a home. Many other slaves heard about this hidden fortress and they came to live with Spartacus. Spartacus was now the leader of the most dangerous group of men in Rome. Most of these men were strong and brave, but they had no military training. Spartacus knew that if they wanted to survive, they needed an army. So he went to the local villages and asked for food and supplies. The people gave him everything he asked for, because they hated the Romans as much as he did. Spartacus then organized groups of men to go out and attack the Romans. These attacks were very effective because the Romans didn't know what to do. They had never fought against slaves before. Spartacus's army grew larger and larger. Soon he had an army of 40,000 men. In 71 BC, Spartacus and his army attacked the Roman legion. This was a turning point in history, because it was the first time slaves had ever gone against the Roman army. The slaves won the battle, and from that moment on, no one doubted them. Spartacus was now seen as a god among men. The slaves loved him and respected him. After defeating the Roman legion, Spartacus continued to attack Roman outposts. This made the Romans very mad, and they wanted revenge. The next year, two Roman generals, Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, were put in charge of putting down the rebellion. Crassus and Pompey were both ambitious and ruthless men. They wanted to be the first ones to defeat Spartacus. So the two generals split up their forces and marched on the slaves. Spartacus and his army were outnumbered, but they still managed to win the battle. After the battle, Spartacus's army grew even larger because more and more slaves wanted to join him. For the next 3 years, Spartacus and his army continued to fight the Romans. They fought throughout Italy, Greece, and Macedonia. No matter how many times the Romans thought they had Spartacus, he always managed to escape. Spartacus's name was now known throughout the empire. People would whisper his name in fear, but not everyone was happy about the rebellion. Many Romans admired Spartacus and his army, but most of them didn't. They said that the slaves were animals and didn't deserve to be treated like humans. The Roman Senate offered Spartacus a deal. They said that if he surrendered, they would free him and his army. But Spartacus refused. He wanted complete freedom for all slaves, not just himself and his army. Finally, in 71 BC, Spartacus and his army were trapped in a mountain pass in Italy. They had been fighting for 4 years and were exhausted. Also, winter was coming soon, and they wouldn't be able to get enough food. Spartacus knew that they couldn't stay here any longer. He had to find a way out. He led his army through the mountains and into a secret valley. There was a small village in the valley, and Spartacus wanted to get food from them. But when he arrived, the villagers closed their gates and locked them from the inside. Spartacus and his army were starving. They hadn't eaten in days. Many of them began to die. Just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, the Romans found them. Crassus and Pompey had set up camp nearby and were waiting for Spartacus to come to them. Spartacus and his remaining army fought bravely, but it wasn't enough. The Romans overpowered them and captured Spartacus. Spartacus was taken to Rome in chains. He was paraded through the streets so that everyone could see him. Then he was thrown into the Colosseum. The crowd cheered as Spartacus entered the arena. He knew that this was the end, but he didn't care. He had done all he could, and now it was up to the gods. As the crowd watched, Spartacus fought to the death. He killed many gladiators, but eventually he was surrounded. He fought until his last breath. The crowd was amazed by his bravery. They had never seen a slave fight like that before. When Spartacus was dead, the Romans crucified him. They put his body on display so that everyone could see him. But even in death, Spartacus was a hero to the slaves. They whispered his name and told stories of his bravery. Even though Spartacus was defeated, his army continued to fight the Romans for years. In the end, the Romans couldn't beat the slaves. They had to free them all. This was the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. Rome would fall in for 76 AD. Many historians say that it was all because of Spartacus. Now, check out "This Man Sold Rome to Barbarians" or watch "How Much Gold Did Ancient Rome Actually Have?"